Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The real and imagined migrant crisis engulfing Europe. What accounts for the EU's near indifference to the plight of refugees clamoring to enter European countries? Could it be that these people are from countries NATO members have attacked, turned into failed states, or havens for terrorists? These refugees never wanted to leave home in the first place. To CrossTalk the refugee crisis, I'm joined by my guest, Sukan Chandan in London. He's a political analyst and blogger. Also in London, we have Tim Finch. He is a migration expert and writer. And in Brighton, we cross to Anders Lustgarten. He is a playwright and activist. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules. In fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much appreciate it. Sukan, in London, if I can go to you first, in looking at a lot of the reports, media reports, Western media, and then even looking at some official reports, looking at the United Nations, some of the things coming out of the European Union. In reading this literature and watching this media, I found a huge disconnect when we look at these refugees coming in to Europe. And I'm thinking of Italy, I'm thinking of Greece, Macedonia, even the UK to some extent, if you can get across the channel. There's the disconnect about why these people are coming to Europe. That part of the story isn't really told much. Go ahead.
Well, there's a reason why it's not told, because then people actually understand in a human-to-human level of what is going on with the plight of these masses of our people who are trying to come to Europe. The vast majority of refugees and people trying to get into Europe who are non-European come from Afghanistan, Syria and Somalia. And you can add to that Yemenis as well. Now, these are people who have been directly impacted by the foreign policies, indeed, of the British state for many years, if not decades. So the British have traumatized and destabilized and turned these once quite stable, decent countries, in the case of all three countries actually, into a death squad militia hellhole. So it's no surprise that people may want to choose to leave the head-chopping militias, the looters, the rapists, the sexual enslavers and the human traffickers who are proliferating in their homelands, facilitated by the leading NATO powers, and trying to come to those lands who have impacted this and looted their countries, not only in the recent past, but if we zoom out in the last couple of centuries. These are countries that are, many of them are younger than you and I, Peter. These are countries who have been looted totally and devastated by the genesis, historical chronological genesis of what is known as European democracy and the West, so-called. So these people have an absolute positive right to come here, because they are only coming here because they were there, i.e. the colonialists and the imperialists. Okay, Tim, if I can go to you in London, you heard what we just listened to. How would you react to that?
Well, I think it's a fairly hysterical view of recent history and further back. Although I take the point, Britain and other Western countries with a colonial past and with recent interventions certainly has some responsibility for these refugees, and it isn't exercising it. But I think the description that it's all down to the colonial past or recent interventions isn't quite right, and I think it is fair enough for Europe both to want to protect its borders to a certain extent, and certainly to try and manage the control of refugees as it does with other migrants.
Tim, every country has the right to control its borders. I think all of us would agree on that point here. But it's quite interesting, and we heard from our first guest here the type of people where they're from. I mean, you don't see a strong connection between Western military wars of choice and refugee status. You don't see a strong connection between the two?
Well, I mean, for instance, the biggest number of refugees, and we should certainly be much more generous to them. I want to make that point. And I've been arguing recently that we should do that in a different way, rather than forcing them to travel across the Mediterranean in dangerous ways or even walk into Europe. We should be actively resettling them. But a lot of the refugees from a recent conflict is from Syria. And it doesn't seem to me to be that clear that, say, Britain has any more responsibility for the Syrian conflict than, say, Russia.
Okay, well, Anders, I'll go to you. I mean, Russia didn't start the conflict in Syria. It's respecting the legitimate government, as the United Nations did before all this started here. I know people like to throw Russia under the bus when it comes to Syria, but Russia is not arming these militias that are beheading people, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we have to look at international law, and again, another policy of forced regime change that one country, Russia, decided it would not allow the West to do. Now, we can discuss Syria Syria all we want on this program, but I'd like to stay with the refugees. Anders, would you like to respond to anything we've said so far? Go ahead.
Sure, I think it's a really good introduction. I think there are clear cases where what your first guest was arguing is absolutely true. I mean, Libya, for example, it's fairly evident that Western intervention there, followed by a total failure and betrayal of those people in building any kind of infrastructure, has created the world's greatest client state for people smugglers. It's not a coincidence that so many people from sub-Saharan Africa are coming up through the Libyan route. But there are two big causes of migration, and we haven't discussed yet, one of which is climate change. And that's a really, really important one. It's incredibly difficult to imagine how to address that problem because it's almost already taken place. It's sort of irreversible in certain respects. It's making vast amounts of the global south uninhabitable. And the other one of those that's strongly connected to that is Western intervention through development organizations. So the World Bank has displaced 3.5 million people in the last 10 years through a lot of stuff like land grabbing, land speculation, those kind of activities. You can join that with something that both Russia and the West do, which is to support essentially puppet dictators in developing countries who are very often repressive and crack down on their populations. I'm thinking, for example, of how far we've got behind the Sisi regime in Egypt, which has gone out of its way to destroy the Arab Spring. We're all very supportive of the Arab Spring. That's been crushed by a military regime which has large amounts of Western and Russian backing. So there are a lot of things that the West and other places, the Chinese involvement in despoiling Africa, in exploitation of resources in Africa is a factor. Powerful countries are systematically destroying the infrastructure of poor countries and making it impossible for people to live there.
Okay, so you're shaking your head in dismay in London. Go ahead, jump in.
Blaming Russia and China for despoiling countries is absolute nonsense. Actually, Russia and China are providing stability and respecting the sovereignty of all global South nations. Indeed, if it wasn't for Russia and China, Syria would be totally in the situation that Libya is today and many other countries of the global South. But that aside for a second, now Britain's policy in relation to the migrants is very interesting because it was Britain that lobbied Italy and successfully lobbied Italy to end Mare Nostrum, i.e. Italy's search and rescue mission in the Mediterranean, which was saving tens of thousands of people. And Britain, having destroyed Libya, having directly through its proxy death squad forces, the so-called Free Syrian Army, etc., destroying Syria, is then punishing these people yet again after destroying these countries to say, no, we will enforce a drowning strategy of tens of thousands of people in the Mediterranean Sea. So the British successfully lobbied the end to Mare Nostrum and then totally militarized a 12-mile radius from the Italian shores in the Mediterranean. So Britain is, it's so nefarious role in this whole situation. It was a leading part of the destruction of Libya throughout 2011, and now it's punishing and then re-punishing the Libyan people and those people traffickers, which, by the way, the British were in direct, all these mafia, all these human traffickers, the British were celebrating, as were all the leading NATO powers, as revolutionaries and rebels and freedom fighters in Libya. And now they turn into actually what they are. These are mafia. But the British are concerned that Libya might become a stable place again. So they are actually in cahoots with these people traffickers and leading death squads such as Hakim Belhaj, who is now outed as the Daesh, i.e. the so-called ISIS leader in Libya, who is a direct ally, a primary military ally of the British and the French in Libya.
Tim, it just seems like the law of unintended consequences. I mean, I have to believe they didn't want Libya to turn into a failed state where they have a residing ISIS unit. I mean, I don't think anybody wanted that to happen, but it certainly has happened. What responsibility does the European Union and NATO countries have to these people whose country was completely annihilated when Gaddafi, if you liked him or not, he didn't serve as a threat to anyone, really. Not even to his own people. Go ahead.
Well, I wouldn't accept that last bit, and the previous speaker, I don't quite know what planet he's occupying, but there's certainly, and I'm not here to defend the British government or Western governments, in fact I'm quite critical of them when it comes to their response to the refugee crisis, but and on Mare Nostrum, I think the British government's record on that was really pretty disgraceful. But we need to,
hold on. You called me hysterical. You called me hysterical and you say you don't know what planet I am. Could you qualify that, please?
Well, I'm afraid not, because I just think the description of world history and recent events is completely off beam. But I'm not going to apologise.
Qualify your assertion.
I don't know who you're trying to defend here. No, I'm perfectly serious about it. I don't think you can just whitewash what China and Russia has done around the world and put all the blame on the West. But can we move on to the moving back to the refugee
Make some substantial
crisis?
points.
I do think there needs to be a proper response to this, but I think it is difficult when you have hundreds of thousands of people moving in a disorderly way and in an irregular way through borders. And that's why I think that the response of the European Union should be one of managed and orderly refugee protection.
Okay, Andrews, you're nodding your head here. I mean, obviously we want this to be orderly, but I mean, why did we get in this situation in the first place? And I think that's what Sukan in London is trying to say, is that, you know, this could have been avoided. Go ahead, Andrews. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, I think Sukal I agree with Sukal if he doesn't agree with me, but I think it's, my PhD is actually in Chinese studies, and the degree to which the Chinese are complicit with dubious regimes is not so different from the degree to which the West is complicit. I don't think we should let people off because we like and should be criticising the West. But to be accurate about why I think we have a problem with what Kim's proposing, which I completely agree with, is that we have a problem with migrants, if you like, in the West. The problem is with a very different kind of migrant than we normally like to demonise. It's with the Russian plutocrat, it's with the American hedge fund psycho, and it's with the Saudi oil kleptocrat. And those people, in tandem with their very, very dubious and unpleasant British lackeys, are making use of the system that we have implemented here to distract from their various forms of kleptocracy, money laundering and bullying by demonising migrants.
Okay, all right. Okay, we need to get back on the migrants. I'm going to jump in here, gentlemen. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the refugee crisis facing Europe. Okay, Sukan, I'd like to go back to you in London. Tim on this program twice, if I'm not mistaken, has already lamented that the European Union doesn't have a coherent refugee policy. Why is that? Why isn't there a coherent policy in dealing with this? Because for domestic politics, depending on what country you're in, this is a burning issue, okay? And it's a humanitarian crisis. It's only getting worse. And I'd like to point out to our viewers here, there's more refugees, displaced refugees in Syria as a result of that conflict that haven't come yet. They're still in Syria and in Lebanon. So this could be just the very beginning of something. Sukan in London, why isn't there a policy? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, Peter, you're right, actually, to put things in proportion. The Lebanese government has 1/300th of the resources that European countries has, and dealing with 1.5 million refugees as a result on the Western Death Squad project in Syria. Millions of Libyans are in Tunisia and Egypt, and also Jordan has over 1 million refugees as well. So it's quite rich, pardon the pun, for Europe to be complaining about this, considering that they've looted the rest of the world and now they're complaining about it. The reason why Europe has no coherent strategy, because Britain wants to put all the onus of responsibility on this situation on Greece particularly, and Greece is obviously the weakest link in the European chain and it's suffering the most. And also it wants to put the onus on Germany and other peripheral countries in the European Union, which is obviously an unfair situation. However, I do get concerned when people advocate a coherent strategy, because if there was a coherent strategy in Europe, would it actually be worse than the situation? Would we be seeing people forcibly rounded up and deported to somewhere like Turkey or Egypt or some other place? So I am very concerned about that. And the last point, there's nothing hysterical in the historical factual realities that the rise of Europe was on the basis of totally looting the rest of the world and genocide of native populations. Our countries are struggling to overcome this trauma. But the message to our brothers and sisters coming to Europe is also this, that if you do come to Europe, be part of the struggle to actually develop functionality and stability in your homeland, which Western powers are trying to destabilize and destroy.
Okay, Tim, you lamented about it twice. In your opinion, why isn't there a coherent policy? Is it because different countries have different problems? And I think that, as we just heard, looking at poor Greece, I mean, 7 years of depression, and now they turn around and say, and you take care of your refugee problem because they're hitting your beaches first. I mean, that's really quite insane, considering Greece, the trauma that the Greek people are going through, and now they get this. I mean, that's just benign neglect. Go ahead.
No, I certainly accept that, and I agree with Sukan about this business about who's bearing most of the burden. And this might seem like a relatively small point in the context of that. But of course, countries like Britain are democracies, and governments have to be elected, and they have to take notice of public opinion. Public opinion here is quite hostile or sceptical to what is quite high migration numbers now. And so it's important, when trying to advocate, as I am, for Britain to do much more in a humanitarian way to fulfil its obligations to refugee protection, that it does it in a way which is politically viable. And I think the problem with the current system is you require someone who's a would-be refugee to get to Europe in order to make a claim for asylum. And that's all right for the ones who do, perhaps, but an awful lot don't. And so the plan I'm suggesting is that rather than that happening, what we should do is we should use a currently existing scheme called refugee resettlement, which is administered by the UNHCR, which would mean that people go, as they generally do these days as refugees, first to camps. That's where their asylum claim is assessed, and then there should be much, much more refugee resettlement by Europe. At the moment, it's less than 8,000 places a year. That's a pitiful number, but a lot of people are coming to Europe and claiming asylum. I'd like to switch it round, and I think it would be more politically viable if people were arriving here in a managed and orderly way as already recognised refugees under UN auspices.
Okay, Tim, can I ask you a question? I mean, in the way you're looking at a coherent policy in dealing with refugees, would you suggest to the people in power in European capitals, particularly in this case London, would you suggest slow down or end these quote-unquote humanitarian interventions? Wouldn't that be a good first step to deal with this problem?
I'm not sure if I completely understand the question, but I certainly wouldn't suggest that we shouldn't carry on with search and rescue in the Mediterranean.
No. My question is stop illegal wars in the greater Middle East.
Bombing people and calling it help.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
No, I do agree with that. I mean, if you're saying that, do I think that interventions by that the UK has been part of have been successful? Clearly not. My only point, and I don't want to go back to this too much, but with previous speakers, is I don't think all of the blame for some of the chaos in the world should be heaped on Western shoulders. It can be spread around a bit.
Okay, well, I have a really hard time grasping that. I'm sorry, Tim. If I can go to Anders, I mean, you know, the destruction of Libya was a NATO operation, all right? I don't see that you have to apportion blame. The blame is right staring us all in the face right now. NATO destroyed Libya, destroyed it. One of the most developed economies in Africa is now...
That's absolutely true.
Okay, go ahead, Anders. I mean, if you want to take it from there, go ahead.
No, that's absolutely true. And I think what's interesting is it's the degree to which these alleged humanitarian interventions are undertaken with a combination of psychosis and magical thinking, which is the idea that once we remove Gaddafi or once we remove Saddam Hussein, which is always inevitably predicted to be a much cleaner and simpler and less massively destructive process than it turns out to be, that the magic of the market will somehow generate a vibrant, successful society that will absorb people. And that's not only completely untrue, it's just sort of deranged. And what's happening now is that the blowback from that is starting to come to Europe. The reason there isn't a coherent policy, though, is pretty simple. It's that European countries hate each other. And not we, as normal people, we don't, but the leaderships do. What the migrant issue is showing you is the absolute weakness and corruption of the European Union, which should have been a wonderful entity that was formed after the Second World War in order to give us this greater sense of solidarity and connectivity, and has turned into this disgusting vehicle for neoliberal bullying of small countries. If you see what the EU, and particularly Germany, will do to Greece, why do you think we would be any less destructive and unpleasant towards people from outside the EU? The degree to which European countries are falling apart over the refusal to allocate any form of quotas, even a tiny number of quotas which were proposed. You know, the Hungarians are building a wall. Yeah. It's fair to say walls in history have not been massively successful.
Let me go to Sukan again. Hang on. Let me jump in here.
The British just think they can.
We're running out of time here. Hang on. Sukan, now if I can go to you again, I think it should be much more of a preventative policy here. For example, let's look at Libya. Okay, we can't go back in time, but why can't the Western world, NATO countries, because that's a nice collective right there, say we're going to sanction the Libyan regime, whoever's running it, until you have reforms. Because we're doing everything upside down. You're not doing anything to resolve those issues on the ground. You're just worried about the blowback, the word we heard a couple minutes ago. I mean, I don't, I can bring up Syria. There was a peace process, but, the West had no will. They didn't want to sit down and hash this thing out. Now, there are rumors floating around that they might give it another try. But if you resolve these issues on the ground, then you don't have to worry about what comes afterwards. Refugee crisis. Go ahead.
Well, Muammar Gaddafi in February 2011 said if NATO wants to destroy Libya, you'll be facing exactly what we've been seeing ever since. And this is out of design. And actually, I know, Peter, you and I perhaps disagree to some extent, but you yourself said it. You said wars of choice. You said that the West have decided not to engage in a peace process in Syria. So the British and the French and the United States, they know very well who their allies are. They know who they're working with, and they know what they're capable of. And also in terms of the quote-unquote the magic of the market, i.e. Western capitalism, when has it ever but brought it's only brought trauma and genocide and devastation to the non-European people of the world. Yes, it's financed the welfare state and the spirit of 45 that English socialists are so keen on, while it was conducting genocide in Kenya and Malaya and Aden and other places. So they want this situation. They need Libya is the Afghanistan, is the modern Afghanistan. It's the base for mafia. It's the base for proliferation of terrorism, human traffickers and death squads, etc. It's an absolute fundamental part. And also remember the British policy in relation to Tunisia. The British have sabotaged the Tunisian economy by absolutely destroying the tourist economy and ending the chartered flights, etc., to Tunisia, because they also want to turn Algeria into what they've turned to Libya. Algeria is the big prize for them. So it's directly as a result of Western foreign policy that is creating that our people rightly want to come and escape from the madness. I mean, imagine European people, Western European people, were going through what Libyans and Syrians and Somalis and Afghan people have gone.
Well,
They'll be out of their mind.
I'm sure the reaction will be very different. Tim, if I can go to you, you said that there should be more done for refugees and migrants, okay? Just today, as we sit down to record this program, the U.S. government said it will accommodate 5,000 to 8,000 Syrian refugees in 2016. Do you think that's really very generous on the part of the United States, considering its involvement in the attempt to overthrow the Syrian government? Just up to 8,000. Is that generous?
No, I don't think it's generous at all. And Britain is even worse. In fact, the number of Syrian refugees that we've resettled in the UK is 216. A pathetic record. I mean, more have arrived as asylum seekers. But, I just need to put a bit of balance in here. I know this is Russian television and all that, but the history of Stalinism, Marxist-Leninism, Maoism around the world is not a great record either. And if it comes to what's happening in Syria, propping up the regime in Syria is part of the problem as well.
That's what we call.
So Russia has a responsibility too.
That's what I call whataboutism. And what you're doing right now, Tim, is using a Soviet practice. You're using a Soviet practice. It's called whataboutism. Gentlemen, we've had a fascinating discussion. Okay, many thanks to my guests in London and in Brighton, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk News. I love you.